In this video for Hatshepsut, we'll be having a look at her building program. This is a really big dot point. It's a dot point from which we can be asked an essay question, a 15-mark essay question encompassing her entire building program, or we could be asked a 10-mark question looking at individual aspects of Hatshepsut's building program, like a particular building site that she engaged in building on it and its significance. There's a whole heap of information on this in whole different levels of significance that we need to be able to understand. We're not going to go into all that depth in this video. This is just an overview of Hatshepsut's building program, the significance of certain sites, where she built, and why she engaged in this building program in the first place. So why did Hatshepsut engage in this building program? Well, really, it was the expectation of a New Kingdom king that they do engage in a building program. A lot of that had to do with the economy. The fact that Hatshepsut was in a stable enough position to be able to fund an enormous building program is indicative of how economically stable her rule was and her reign was. It also supported the economy by hiring a whole heap of workers and craftsmen who were then obviously paid, and then that continued to stimulate the economy itself. We've got an image there of one of Hatshepsut's obelisks that never made it out of the quarry because it cracked, and we can see just by the sheer size of it what a monumental feat of engineering it is, and how many workers it would have taken to just even quarry this, let alone move it and position it and design it and all those sorts of things. So we can see how much of an investment it was for Hatshepsut. By engaging in a building program, Hatshepsut also maintained she kept the forces of chaos at bay by continuing to improve Egypt itself. And Amun, by far and away, was one of the most important reasons for Hatshepsut's building program. Almost all her buildings were dedicated to Amun or had some kind of links to Amun, and we know that almost all her buildings were in relation to religion. They were either at temple complexes like Luxor or Karnak, or her own mortuary temple at Dir el-Bahari, so almost all of them had some kind of religious significance and connotation. A couple of really good quotes to talk about in relation to Hatshepsut's building program. The first one's from Barry Kemp, and he says that ideology needs architecture for its fullest expression, which really tells us that Hatshepsut really told us who she was and what her religious and kingly ideology was through her building program. It demonstrated what her priorities were. We've got a quote here from Donald Redford. We must conclude from her repeated references to it that her building program had top priority. So Hatshepsut really did invest a lot in this building program. And it is probably one of the most significant aspects of her reign. It's not the only aspect of her reign, as some early historians thought, that she was only engaged in domestic affairs and building program, but we know it because we have so much evidence for it and how extensive it was, that it really was very important to her. So these two quotes are very good to use and probably should be in essay responses or short responses for Hatshepsut. Moving into some of the elements of her reign and her building program, we're going to look first at those buildings that she constructed from scratch. First one here is Dir el-Bahari. Dir el-Bahari is Hatshepsut's mortuary temple. This is where she would go to be, or people would go to worship her after her death. It's not where she's buried. It is certainly not a tomb. It's a mortuary temple where you'd be worshipped. We have a lot of evidence for this. It is a rock-cut tomb on the western side of the Nile River. It's cut into those Theban cliffs there. And we can see by that image there just how enormous it is and what a feat of engineering it was. And this was quite a new design and was followed by kings later. We have a chapel for Amun up the top, right in the base of the cliff there. And that was important because that's where the bark of Amun would come and be rested for the beautiful festival in the valley, a festival that Hatshepsut created in honor of Amun. So once a year that bark would be transferred across. We also have a whole heap of information about Hatshepsut's reign. So this is where we find the punt reliefs. This is where we find her divine birth and coronation scenes. We also see links to other gods. There's a chapel for Hathor here, which was very important for Hatshepsut. So there's a lot of significance here. We're just providing a very basic overview. There's a lot more depth that we need to understand than just that. We also have the Red Chapel at Karnak. So this was in the temple complex at Karnak. This is what housed that bark of Amun. So this is where that bark was kept before it was possessed to pick up the statue of Amun at the Temple of Amun. So this was dismantled by Thutmose III, but it's been since put back together, and it has a whole heap of religious significance. So this is where that bark was kept, obviously for Amun, and for the beautiful festival in the valley and the Opet festival, both of which there are scenes of inside this chapel. We also have scenes for the Sed festival for Hatshepsut and also her coronation. So lots and lots of information from the Red Chapel for Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut also commissioned 4 obelisks, one of which you can see here, and they're in varying states of placement at the moment. And they were a symbol of Egypt's beliefs in how the world came to be, their creation mythology, which we'll look at more in class time. But they're a monumental engineering feat in and of themselves, so we'll look more at that in class time. The 8th pylon, you can see it highlighted in red there. It's only very small, but she was the first one to put a pylon over on this side of the temple complex at Karnak, and it formed a monumental gateway for a procession from the temple of Amun through to the goddess Mut. We also have the bark sanctuary at Luxor. So this is for the Opet festival, when the bark of Amun would be transported down south. This was where the bark of Amun would be housed for that festival. And finally, we have Hatshepsut's tombs, queenly and kingly tombs. So we need to understand, there's a whole heap of information on this. It's just a very, very brief overview. And there's a whole heap more information we need to learn in relation to her building program. Just finally, we have those buildings that she didn't build from scratch, but those that she restored, either that had been begun by her father or husband, or had been put in or were left in disarray during the Hyksos reign. So the main one is Biosat Timros, which is a rock-cut temple for the goddess Pakhet. But we also have the temple of the Lady of Kusei, we have the temple of Thoth, and perhaps even a great temple for Min. So there's a very brief overview for Hatshepsut's building program. There is a lot more than that, and we'll go into more depth in class.